Hello, folks. Jeff Salzman here, and welcome to the Daily Evolver here on Integral Live, Mondays through Thursday. It's Monday, November 6th, 2017, and I am happy to be here with you and with Corey DeVos, who is the editor-in-chief of Integral Life. Hey, Corey.
Hey, buddy. How you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing great. Did you have a good weekend?
I did.
Good.
And you?
Beautiful weekend. Spent a lovely autumn day with my daughter yesterday. Riding her bike around Celestial Seasonings. It was really great.
Ooh, yeah, nice. Yeah, I kind of hung out here and looked out the window. It's great.
I need one of those days.
Yeah. Well, what I wanted to talk about today is, I think, really one of the most interesting stories developmentally on the planet. And it turns out that there is a lot happening right now. And what I'm talking about is Saudi Arabia and what has been one wild weekend over there. And it's happening in real time. CNN called it 24 hours that shook the Arab world. The New York Times called it Game of Thrones, Saudi style. And I was just talking to Corey a minute ago, and he was saying that the airports are now frozen in Saudi Arabia, and there's a purge basically going on by the ruling prince, who is the son of the king, who's 80-some years old. The prince is Mohammed bin Salman. He's 32. And he took over in a bit of a coup in June, where he displaced his cousin as the sort of chief executive of the country. And on Saturday night, he instigated a midnight blitz. In fact, I'll read from the New York Times. A midnight blitz of arrests has ensnared dozens of the most influential figures in Saudi Arabia, including 11 of the prince's royal cousins. In what by Sunday appeared to be the most sweeping transformation in the kingdom's governance for more than 8 decades. That's saying a lot. Crown Prince Mohammed, King Solomon's favorite son and key advisor, now appears to have established control over all 3 Saudi security services: the military, internal security services, and the National Guard, which for generations had been distributed among branches of the House of Saud to preserve a balance of power. So it's all under him now. They go on to say, in the same stroke, the crown prince has cowed businessmen and royals across the kingdom by taking down the undisputed giant of Saudi finance, Prince Alawid bin Talal, the Warren Buffett of the Middle East. And I don't know if you know who this is. I kind of did, but I mainly knew him because he does these videos of himself in front of his yacht, and he's a real playboy with, bare-chested and the whole kind of Putin thing. So he's been arrested. And over the last several weeks, the new prince has ordered enough high-profile arrests of intellectuals and clerics to frighten the remainder of the academic and religious establishment into acceding to his will as well. And I was listening to a report on it from Morning Joe this morning, and they had Brett Stevens on, who's a columnist for the New York Times. And he described it, I think, pretty well. He said, this is 1/3 Ataturk. That is, Ataturk is the secular leader who led Turkey into the modern age, starting about 100 years ago. So this is a revolution from above, moving the country into a more secular path. The second, it's 1/3 Xi Jinping, which is the leader of China, just a sheer consolidation of power, which is what we saw in the last couple of weeks at their Communist Party convention. And he said it's 1/3 Henry Kissinger, mobilizing Saudi Arabia's defenses against Iran, their avowed Shiite enemy. So on the face of things, what Prince Mohammed wants to do is move Saudi Arabia into a post-oil economy. What happens in a lot of developing countries is they get their money by selling their natural resources to the modern world. And this was, of course, done in spades in Saudi Arabia when they discovered that they were sitting on an ocean of oil in 1930s. And so he's trying to move it into a post-oil economy because that's where the world's going. And he has this Vision 2030, which is about the changes that are going to be made between now and 2030. And one of them, and sort of the keystone of the whole thing, is this new city that they're building on the Red Sea up in the northwest corner of the country with bridges connecting it to Egypt and Jordan. It's a new city called Neom. And it is just a completely modern city where women will be able to dress like men, and it'll be just basically a modern city in this somewhat pre-modern country. And this is where I think integral theory really helps us to appreciate what's going on here, because on a developmental scale, Saudi Arabia is almost in a league of its own. We talk about how a lot of our political problems in the States and in the developed world is that we are stretched over 3 stages of development. We have traditionalists, the right, we have modernists, the secular middle, and we have postmodern, the left. And that, they're at war, and, they're about a third of the people in each of those categories. Well, in Saudi Arabia, they're covering 4 stages, and maybe even 5 or 6, depending on how you want to slice and dice it. But, the other thing I'd say is that we've been working on our modernization for several hundred years. They've been working on theirs for about 100. Even 100 years ago, the Arab Peninsula was populated by Bedouin nomads, which is Arabic for desert dwellers. And they had herds of goats and camels. And like all nomads, they had the consciousness, the center of gravity of what we would say is roughly red, or a warrior stage of gravity. It's very clannish, very warlike. And religiously, they basically had a foot in 3 different stages. They had a nature mysticism going on, where they worshiped the natural forces of wind and water and so forth. They were red in that they worshiped their warrior god who would lead them into battle. This is sort of the Old Testament God. And then they had the amber traditional, which is the transcendent Allah God who is in heaven. And this is a very, kind of a potent mixture of the sort of a religious sensibility. Culturally, of course, very conservative. You cannot trust men. This is pre-10 Commandments in a way. I mean, you took what you could get is the sort of the ethic of the culture. I was trying to get a feel for this. And so I was looking at some Bedouin stories and poetry, and it's really interesting. I'll read a little bit of it. In red culture, selfishness is actually encouraged. You look after yourself first. It's weird and odd in a way to those of us who are living in a modern world where we emphasize fairness and compassion and the golden rule, and even things like loving our enemy. We do that imperfectly, but at least it is a stated goal, ideal. And that's not what we're talking about in the day-to-day reality of red, where it's a daily struggle to survive in a tough neighborhood, in a tough land. And one of the most famous Bedouin slogans that is always, I doing some research on this a couple years ago, and it's really stuck with me, is it says this: I, my brother, and my cousin against the stranger. I and my brother against my cousin. I against my brother. And isn't that something? Just let that sink in. Here's some more of the sort of honor code of that stage of development. And remember that an honor code at red, at this warrior stage of development, doesn't mean that people act in the way that we understand the term honorably. That definition of honor is really traditional, the next stage of development. It means that you're good and you play by the rules, you're an honorable person. That's a little later. What we're talking about with red honor codes is that you must be honored, you know, that you must be seen as strong, you must be respected, and, you know, people need to make way for you. That's the ideal. And that's where it's at when it's you against your brother. So this is a couple stanzas from a poem by 6th century Bedouin poet Labid. And, you know, I kind of love this too in a way. He says, "He who shows kindness to one not deserving it, his praise is unworthy, and there will be reproach against him, and he will repent of having shown kindness. And he who is always seeking to bear the burdens of other people and does not refuse these people who want them to bear their burdens, he will one day be debased and will repent of his kindness." So there you have it. You know, it's such an interesting thing, this anti-kindness ethic and this, you know, just toughness. And, you know, this is, of course, why you would cover your women, that, you know, these stallions, these men who are so manly, you know, they can't be trusted to control themselves around an unhidden woman, or, you know, a woman who is enshrouded. And so this is sort of still this is 100 years ago. You know, there's still a lot of this soul in the Saudi Arabian psyche, you know. And then they went into modernization like, you know, gangbusters in the mid-1930s with the discovery of oil. And that began a long era of, you know, this oft-told story of either conquest, out-and-out conquest, or deals being made between modern economies and pre-modern cultures where the modern people come in for the resources. And there's, you know, a deal where the ruling family or the ruling cabal agrees to keep the natives from getting too restless, and, you know, they sell the oil, and, you know, so we have this stretching apart of the society where we still have this sort of wild power god, shroud the women, keep them hidden, this Wahhabism. And then on one hand, and then on the other hand, we've stretched over to where the elites have become modern and postmodern. You know, we all have heard the endless stories of Saudis who get on their private jets and take off their hijabs, and they, you know, put on their high heels and break out the booze and go shopping in Paris, and you know, they're just filthy rich, very sophisticated, sending their kids to schools in Switzerland, and, you know, becoming, you know, sort of crazy modern in a way. And I'll talk about that a minute. And so Prince Mohammed comes in, he's 32 years old. And one of the things he's been doing is he's been really trying to dismantle this extreme ideology of Wahhabism. As we know, 15 of the 19 attackers on 9/11 were citizens of Saudi Arabia and were adherents to this extreme, you know, if you're not in my sect, you are an infidel, and my job in my holy war is to kill you for God. That's, you know, that's what we're dealing with. So he has prohibited the religious police from being able to make arrests. That's a huge thing. Women are now allowed, they will be allowed to drive next year. He allowed movie theaters to open, music to be played at public events. And, you know, he's dealing with a backlash where, as he said here from the New York Times again, dozens of hardline clerics have been detained, while others were designated to speak publicly about respect for other religions, a topic once anathema to the kingdom's religious apparatus. So this is a an effort to modernize, or at least moderate, this fanatical Islam. And the same thing is happening in Egypt with al-Sisi, who is declared that Islam must modernize, be reformed, as they put it. Here's a quote from one of the conservative clerics. He said, "Of the new acceptance of gender mixing and music at public events, he said he was against it. He was against changing the status of women in ways that he said violated Islamic law. He said, they want her to dance. They want her to go to the cinema. They want her to uncover her face. They want to show her legs and thighs. That is liberal thought, and it is a corrupting ideology." And here's a couple of the extremes of what we're talking about. I have a share screen here. Yeah, here we go. This is the new city that they're building. This is Noah. And yet we have a billboard. Wait, oh yeah, no, this is one of their new robots called Sophia that is getting a lot of blowback because she's white. She's not wearing a hijab, and you know.
And they gave her honorary citizenship.
And they gave her honorary citizenship,
which is about as postmodern a move as you can get for a country like Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, what do you think? And hang on just a second. Oh, here it is. I was going to show. This is a billboard from Saudi Arabia, and the billboard says, "Veil is security." The veil is security, and you can see that it's an unwrapped piece of candy that has flies buzzing around it. That would represent the men. And then you have a piece of candy that's all wrapped up and safe. So, you know, at least we don't have to deal with that in our country anymore. But that's what they're dealing with. I mean, it's really, imagine just the sort of stretching apart of the culture in the ways that they have to deal with. I think it's really interesting to see one of the phenomena that happened when we talk about these people who are basically, their great-grandparents were nomads, and here they are, you know, with millions and billions of dollars, just traveling the world, just all the goodies of modernity. And you see this sort of aesthetic that arises out of this. And you see in Saudi Arabia these palatial estates. And many of them are, you know, quite beautiful to look at. They have the architects from all over the world to come in, but they all have this sort of pre-modern aesthetic of grandiosity. And this is, you know, this look at me sort of aesthetic of marble and gold, and every surface is a work of art. And there's artificial lakes and fountains and gardens. And there's these pictures, you can see them on the internet of all the men of the house in front of the palace with the fleet of Bentleys and Lamborghinis, and of course their yachts. And it's what money will buy, you know. And I was reading an article about that. This is sort of the aesthetic of autocrats all around the world. And the English decorator Nikki Haslam has dubbed this style Louis the Hotel. And I love that. They write, "Think French. There may never have been an interior style quite as lavish as 18th century France. A look that allows for deep, curvy marble chimney pieces, chairs covered in gilding and furniture slathered with ormolu. Visit just about any Arab grandee in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, or Dubai, and he'll be sitting in a new French gold chair. Sometimes dictators pull from other places and eras, Roman, Palladian, classical, and more. But French can always be counted on to say money faster and louder than the subtler English antique look." And so I wanted to just play a little game here with you. And this game is called Trump or Saudi. And this is, let me see. Yeah, I go here. Because we have a president who ascribes to that same aesthetic. So here we go. Ready? Trump or Saudi? That's
Trump.
Nope, Saudi.
Ah.
And it's a grand entranceway with all this marble and blue fabric. And
I should have known there's not enough gold.
Beautiful in a way. Yeah. And so that's Trump.
Trump.
This is the entry to his grand hallway in Trump Tower in New York. You can look out the skyscraper and see the other buildings. And let's walk in and meet with the residents. And here we are. Donald and Melania and little Baron on a stuffed lion. And he even has little toy cars, except they're limousines. His little toy cars are limousines. There's actually a little, I'm sure, $300,000 race car here too. But
did Don Jr. shoot that lion?
I don't know. Isn't that something? And then we have Melania actually has quite a modest little office in Trump Tower. Some nice art. But you can see this. I love this Louis the Hotel aesthetic. This is Saudi.
Saudi.
What would this be, do you think?
I'm going Saudi.
Mar-a-Lago. Trump.
Mar-a-Lago. Man, I'm bad at this.
It's probably a 30-foot ceiling with crystal chandeliers and the whole bit. And then I think that's it. Yeah, then we go back to the...
I had a hard time with that game, Jeff. I think I'm out of my pay grade.
But it is interesting because, in a way, Trump's the sort of personification of some of what we see going on in Saudi Arabia. He has the heart and soul of a Red Warrior stage. It's look at me, it's bling, it's babes, a harem. It's the modern version. And he's contained in a modern culture. And so, the worst impulses are sort of moderated by the modern and postmodern aspects. And that same is true with Saudi Arabia. I mean, they have this sort of soul that goes down to the earlier stages of magenta and red and amber, but they're also contained in this modern world. And, it'll be interesting to see what happens. But what's sort of, I think, extra interesting about it is that it's happening right now, right this minute. And we can sort of feel it. So I think that's worth noticing. Any thoughts, Corey?
Well, it's such a, before the show, we were talking about, these stories, when they happen, they're so massively complex with so many moving parts that it can be really, really hard to sort of hold the fullness of this. Like this, this weekend Saudi Arabia story, this is going to have massive geopolitical consequences and ripples that we're not going to really even begin to detect until, years from now. So I'm really curious to see how this is going to unfold, because I think it touches everything. I think it touches, if this ends up raising the prices of crude oil, that's a win for Putin, which is an interesting context. And then we have, the information about Kushners' impromptu trip to Saudi Arabia last week, and everyone's starting to ask questions. What exactly were you doing there? What were you talking about? Were you trying to give some sort of forewarning that this was about to happen, or what have you?
Or approval.
Yeah, absolutely.
Jeff,
I love how you actually turned this conversation to look at the architecture, which I am fascinated by, and it actually, in a lot of ways, this links in with some of what we were talking about last week. Last week we were given a question about whether or not Islam is inherently more violent than Christianity, or if it was able to go through its sort of organic reformation, how helpful would that be? And it's interesting because the story of modernization in Saudi Arabia and a lot of these other Arab countries is it's challenging because, yeah, they absolutely, in the lower right quadrant at least, there's been a lot of pressures to modernize, but a lot of those pressures didn't necessarily come from within the society itself. A lot of those pressures were being imposed upon it from external sources, namely the United States of America. And a lot of, the situation that Saudi Arabia finds itself in today was developed by the CIA in the 1950s, which is, again, just sort of an interesting thing where, Saudi Arabia was able to modernize in such a way that actually perpetuated its monarchy, right? Rather than challenging its monarchy. Now, a century later, those, I think chickens are coming home to roost a little bit. But I think that's really interesting to watch the culture sort of, as it typically does, lagging behind the lower right quadrant in terms of its own evolution.
No, that's right. I mean, I do think that this Prince Mohammed is trying to move Saudi Arabia into modernity.
Yeah, I do too.
In all four quadrants.
Yep, and I think it's a power grab, and probably an appropriate one.
Well,
right?
Yeah, it may be. I mean, this is where autocracy has an advantage over democracy.
That's right.
You can actually make decisions and make things happen. But, you can't really change people's interiors. I mean, we're seeing this, or at least not quickly. So we can see in Turkey, where Turkey became a modern country. The Muslim garb was outlawed by Ataturk. They had to start dressing Western. And, we all sort of thought, well, they had become Western.
Yeah.
And it turns out that when you actually have a democracy, there's that deep soul that is not Western. Yeah. It's Turkish, and it's traditional, and it's maybe even a little pre-traditional, and it's ethnocentric, and it doesn't like the sexual revolution, and it doesn't want to be like America. And so you have Turkey that looks like it's going backwards.
Yeah.
But actually, it's just sort of catching up with itself.
Yeah.
And so this is the problem that this Prince Mohammed will have, that El-Sisi has, that, we have these sort of modern dictatorships and dealing with pre-modern people. And, let's hope that they've learned how to do it better than we've done it in the past. That's generally what happens. And,
yeah.
Well,
it's interesting. It's interesting, right, that a lot of Western nations are dealing with sort of these new regressive currents, and nations like Saudi Arabia are actually experiencing some progressive currents, which is again just interesting. The other
along those lines, Corey, the media in Saudi Arabia has played this up as a anti-corruption campaign. Right. That's what he has played it up as too, and it may well be.
Yeah,
I mean, because these, arresting 11 of your cousins is, you got to be really committed to do that. And apparently the younger generation of Saudis is all for this guy and all for what happened this weekend. And that is encouraging.
Yeah. Drain the swamp. Masaga.
Drain the swamp, baby.
Masaga.
Yeah.
The other 2 points I was going to raise, Jeff, is I think that, allowing women to drive is freaking huge. It's absolutely huge. And I think that itself is going to have massive consequences for this culture over the next several decades. Yeah. I mean, we've seen time and time again in developing nations, the minute you give women more liberties, that society's transformation is suddenly accelerated. Yeah. Which is interesting. And the other thing, back to the architecture, I find myself more appreciative of sort of the Arabic flavors of ostentation than I am with the Trumpian, because it makes more sense. When I think about Saudi Arabia and its lineage, its culture, its heritage, this is an incredibly powerful nation that built itself on top of a desert, right? Yeah. Where, I mean, scarcity is, for millennia, has been the name of the game in these nations.
No, they
And,
just
you know,
try to
when you
eke
look
out
at,
a living.
yeah,
Eke out
that's right.
survival.
That's right. And so when you look at, you know, I mean, going all the way, I mean, as far back as we can go in architecture, looking at these great pyramids, I mean, these were, as you know, these weren't just sort of narcissistic immortality projects on behalf of the pharaohs. I mean, they were also a statement of conquering the environment. You know, I mean, here we are in the midst of a desert, and we're going to, you know, build a monument that survives for thousands of years as a testament to our survival. And when you couple that with Islamic culture, which has, you know, very specific outlines, aesthetic guidelines around how Allah, how spirit can be represented. You know, they deliberately outlaw personification of their deity, which actually, you know, in my experience, has infused, or, you know, sort of Arab aesthetics with this sublime spiritual sort of essence that you don't necessarily find in a lot of Western art, because Western art is very much about, you know, characterizing our deities, personifying our deities.
Mm-hmm.
And with
More
Islam, you see it in the math, you see it in the patterns, you see it, you know, so there's sort of the coupling of that religiously guided aesthetics, which actually has created, I think, more beauty in a certain sense, coupled with this, you know, this drive towards creating the most massive, ostentatious monuments you possibly can that'll survive again for thousands of years. It makes a certain kind of sense in you know, these cultures. Whereas when Trump does it, you know, I just sort of like, oh, you're just wrapping everything in gold leaf, and, you know, how embarrassing, how shallow, how, you know, gross.
No, yeah, well, yeah, and it's yeah, that ostentation is red is ostentatious.
Yeah.
It just wants to look at me.
Yeah.
And look how much I have. I mean, that's how you got respect and status.
Yep.
And when by the time we get to modern, and particularly postmodern, all of that's kind of embarrassing. You know, so we look at Trump, who's still there.
Yep.
It's like, look at me, look at my plane, look at my, you know, painted, he has these painted ceilings in his house.
Yep.
You know, it's like the Sistine Chapel.
Yeah.
And this little kid's playing with toy limousines.
Right.
And it's like embarrassing,
yeah.
But not to him.
Yep. No, that's right. And then finally, Jeff, how weird is that robot? I mean, how weird. Did you watch the video of the press conference they did with that robot?
Yeah.
And, you know, we're actually about to enter this really bizarre, brave new world where, you know, my daughter's generation is going to be contending with the issues of civil rights for artificial intelligence. This is just something that is inevitably coming down the line over the next few decades. And here we have a story where, again, Saudi Arabia, of all countries, makes a artificial intelligence an honorary citizen. That it's such a bizarre story in the least likely country in the world for this to happen.
What a crazy mixed up world.
It's bizarre.
Yeah. All righty. Well, I think that'll do it. Anything else, Corey?
I don't think so.
Cool, man. Well, thanks for listening, everybody, and we'll see you back here live tomorrow. Take care.